And we're live.
Good evening, everybody. Welcome. I'm Jennifer LaRue, and I can't tell you how thrilled I am to be hosting tonight's program on behalf of the Mark Twain House Museum in Hartford, Connecticut. I will share with you that I am a lifelong Titanic fanatic. And so when I knew that the museum was planning this program, I was delighted to be asked to host it. And I know that having spent some time in the green room just now with our panelists, you're going to enjoy every moment of tonight's program. So I'm not going to stay too long on screen. I know you're eager to hear what they have to say rather than what I have to say. But I do want to just first of all introduce you to a few features of Crowdcast, the virtual program, virtual platform that we're using tonight. I see that many of you are participating in the chat, and that's awesome. Please continue to chime in. Let us know where you're from. Let us know what your connection to the Titanic is. Anything you'd like to share with us there, we'd love to hear. Know that tonight's program is being recorded. And so if you want to come back and watch it again anytime you like, you can do so simply by following the same link that you used to get here tonight. And do know that the chat remains live in perpetuity. So if you strike up a conversation, make a friend, or start an interesting thread, you can come back and continue that conversation anytime you like. While we're talking about the chat, though, I'd like to ask you, please, we're going to have a Q&A session toward the end of the program. Rather than putting your questions for our panelists over there in the chat area, if you could do me the favor of placing your questions at the bottom of the screen where you see the words "ask a question," that will make that part of the program go very much more smoothly and make my life a lot easier. And also you can look at the questions that other people have asked and you can vote for them. So when you upvote a question, it lifts it to the top of the pile. So keep your eye on the chat, on the ask a question area, and please chat away, but ask the questions in the ask a question area. While we're looking at ask a question, I'd ask you just to raise your gaze a tiny bit and look at that long green button that talks about your support being vital. It is very vital to the Mark Twain House Museum and to our co-sponsor tonight, the Titanic International Society. Both of them are doing really good work, and COVID has not been easy for anybody. The Mark Twain House Museum in particular has been really dedicated to keeping these author talks and other programs offered virtually, sometimes as many as 3 or 4 a week. And rarely does the museum charge a registration fee for these programs, but do know that that doesn't mean that these programs are free. They do cost money for the museum to mount. And so anything you can do to help the museum continue to offer these programs or to defray the costs of all the ones they've done in the past is very deeply appreciated by the Board of Trustees and the staff of the museum. And tonight's proceeds and donations are being split evenly between the Titanic International Society, which we'll hear more about in a little bit, and the Mark Twain House Museum. I'd like to thank our sponsors. Tonight's program, like all of the virtual programs offered by the museum, is sponsored by the Wish You Well Foundation and by Connecticut Public, WNPR. It's produced in part with support honoring the legacy of Frank Lord, who was a much beloved, very dedicated trustee of the museum, who sadly passed away last year. And the museum is delighted to be able to honor Frank's memory by offering these programs. Please check out marktwainhouse.org for information about all kinds of upcoming programs, both virtual and live in person. Increasingly, the museum is dipping its toe back into having live in-person author talks. So please check that out if you're in the greater Hartford area or near, that you could take part in those. So having said all of that, I'm going to very, very briefly introduce all of our panelists. And there's so many of them, I don't want to go into too much depth about any of their backgrounds or experience, but I do know that I'm just scratching the surface with all of them. So we're joined tonight by Tad Fitch, author of On a Sea of Glass, The Life and Loss of the RMS Titanic, and Titanic, Solving the Mysteries. J. Kent Williams also helped write Titanic, Solving the Mysteries. Charlie Haas, Titanic, A Journey Through Time, and Titanic, Triumph and Tragedy. Bill Wormstedt, Titanic, Solving the Mysteries, and Brandon Whited, Gilded Tragedy, West Virginia's Titanic Widow. And our moderator tonight is our dear friend, Jason Scappaticci. He's a historian with a special interest in the golden age of ocean liners. So everybody, please join me in giving a great big Mark Twain House and Museum welcome to Jason and all of our participants tonight. Good evening, everybody. Thank you for being here with us.
Good evening, Jen.
Jason, I'm going to sit back and enjoy this conversation with everybody else, but will you call me back up, please, when it's time to help with the Q&A?
Absolutely.
Awesome. Well, enjoy and have fun, and I'll see you in a little bit.
Thank you so much, Jen. And it's great to be back with the Mark Twain House. So for those of you in the audience who were at our other Titanic talk, I think you are in for a great treat. I have had the pleasure of chatting with these gentlemen a little bit this week, and they are really fascinating. So we're just gonna jump right in, guys. What I thought we'd start with this evening is, we can tell by the interest, right, that the Mark Twain House alone has hosted more than one event about Titanic already this year. There's books that are published, major motion pictures that are made of Titanic, and here we are 110 years later, and people are still fascinated by this. And I think in your book, Bill, Tad, and Kent, you discuss in your introduction a little bit of like the enduring legacy about this. I think you say, actually, there's something truly magical about the Titanic. It is difficult to define, perhaps impossible, but it still endures, right? And so I thought it'd be kind of interesting to kick off with you all on this. So Kent, can you take us away with this? Why do you think Titanic endures 110 years later?
Thank you for having me tonight, Jason. It's a really good question. I know that many authors, many historians, many enthusiasts have tried to answer that question through the years. And there doesn't seem to be one defining thing about Titanic that makes it so magical. One of the things I think today is how different those times in 1912 were to what we see today. In 1912, there was a lot of optimism about what the future held. Technology was on the move. It was making a lot of progress. And today you don't see quite that optimism in the general public, in the public at large. And so there's something innocent about those pre-World War I years. And it is really captured in those few days that Titanic was at sea, because they've been so well documented, so well recorded. And for many of the people who were on the ship, truly those were magical times as well. Many of them, their lives were never going to be the same again after the ship went down. And so it's a fascinating glimpse into something of a lost world that we can hardly even understand on its own terms today.
Yeah, thank you, Kent. And it even just occurred to me actually while you were speaking that Downton Abbey actually kicks off with the sinking of the Titanic, right? Like that's what kicks the whole plot line off, right? Charlie, the other night when we were talking, you had some interesting observations about why you think the legacy of the Titanic endures. Would you mind sharing those with us?
I'd be glad to, Jason. Titanic was a microcosm of the world in 1912. And it's interesting to see that there were 28 different nationalities on that ship. Everything from multimillionaires to the poorest immigrant. And somewhere in that population, we find someone like ourselves, and we tend to look at the disaster through their eyes. There's also the fullest possible range of reactions to an emergency. People that take charge and solve problems and think outside the box. People who are devastated by the loss of loved ones and everything in between. So, and the other thing that comes to mind is there are so many different ways of approaching this. You can look at it from a naval architecture standpoint or a sociological standpoint. There was even one person who cast the ship's horoscope. They used the launch time of 12 noon on May 31st, 1909, as the birth date of Titanic. And of course, all the stars were completely terrible and the ship was doomed right from the start. But I think that's part of it also. You can take it in so many different directions. As a journalism teacher, I find the study of communications, why communications in so many ways failed that night is another way to approach it. So there's something for everyone in that story.
I love that somebody made the star chart for Titanic. I had no idea, Charlie, that was a thing. I'm not surprised, right? But I love it. That's great. Brandon, I read your book about the West Virginia widow, and it really struck me while reading that book, that you say that she initially thought that her husband got off. He said, "Oh, I'm going to get on another lifeboat. Trust me, everything's fine." And it occurred to me there were probably a lot of widows that were lied to that night, right? To get off, right? I'm going to be okay. I'll meet you later. So can you tell us a little bit about this, this realization that she finally had that her husband did not actually get off? And in your research, did you find women talk about that after they had survived and realized that their husbands had really told them this one last lie, right?
Right. Yes. Lucian Smith, he said, he had to really coax Eloise to get her into the lifeboat because she was not wanting to go. So he finally said, "The boat is thoroughly equipped. Everyone on board will be saved." She even point blank asked him, "Are you being honest?" And he said, "Yes." She trusted him. He was the love of her life. And when she heard the screams after the ship went down, she initially believed it was crew members and third-class passengers who hadn't made it up to the decks in time. She didn't dream Lucian was one of them until on the Carpathia, she kept seeing the boats come in and her Lucian never came up the ladder. At that point, she was just broken by that. I haven't personally, I don't remember reading of any other widows citing that specific statement from a husband. Offhand, I believe maybe Edgar Meyer said something similar to Leela. I could be wrong about that. They were all together on the boat deck, the Meyers and the Smiths. I believe he may have said something similar because Leela and Eloise both got into number 6. And of course that was later used in A Night to Remember. Lucian's speech was sort of paraphrased by a fictional character in the film A Night to Remember. So it was a very powerful statement.
And the Smiths were newlyweds too.
2 months. Yes, they were married 2 months and knew each other at least 3 months, probably not much longer than that.
And that's a facet of the Titanic that I hadn't really thought much about until I read your book about newlyweds. And you said there were other newlywed couples too.
Yeah, there were 13 honeymooning couples on board.
Did any couples survive?
They did. There were a few. The Harders survived together. The Bishops survived, and the Dicks survived. They were honeymooning as well. And I know I'm probably forgetting a few who survived intact. Yes, unfortunately, the Smiths weren't among them. Those couples who survived intact happened to come, out on the starboard side and get into the very early boats that were allowing the men to get in with their wives.
Right. And I think as your book says, and many other books, that it really depended on what side of the boat deck you ended up on, right? If it was light hauler loading,
ultimately
then you probably,
it did.
Right?
Yes. I mean, if they came out on the starboard side,
right,
maybe Lucian maybe they would have been with those other honeymooning couples.
Right.
In number 7, number 5,
And Charlie, you've met actually a couple of Titanic survivors. Did you meet any? I assume then you probably met some widows who lost their husbands on Titanic.
No, I never met a widow. No.
Okay.
I met probably about 12 or 15 of the survivors over the years. And it, of course, was an entrancing experience to hear it right from them in terms of what that night was like. Would you like me to talk about a couple that I met? Okay.
Absolutely, yeah, please.
I knew Eva Hart very well. She lived in a suburb of London. Every time I went to England to research, I would stop by and visit her. And I was always very careful to bring a frog with me. Eva collected frogs, plastic frogs, ceramic frogs, any kind of an American fry was especially prized by her. And I remember the last time we met, she actually cooked me a lamb dinner, and she was very proud of the fact that the mint sauce was made with mint that was gathered from her garden. But she had an amazing recollection. She was only 7 on the Titanic, and she recalled very distinctly things like her father was a carpenter, a fine woodworker, and he was exclaiming over the quality of the workmanship of the bird's eye maple lining inside the second class elevator. I mean, literally, no one else would even have remembered that. In 1981, I was asked to go to Stuttgart in Germany, and Eva was there to join me. And bear in mind that this is 70 years after the disaster, and she still could not bear to look at a picture of the ship sinking because it reminded her of the night that she lost her dad. And she was touched by that emotion really for the rest of her life. One other, if I may, was Philip Frank Axe. He lived in Norfolk, Virginia. Great big guy, 6 feet 3 or 4, and he was a very powerful, strong guy. He was made a fortune during World War II selling scrap metal, of all things, and it was quite fun. He was married to Marie, and she was delightful. She would serve as his brother, as a rudder or a brake, and every so often Frank would come out with a whopper of some sort, and you'd just see Marie rolling her eyes like, oh no, here he goes again. But the best memory I have of Frank, Jack and I were visiting him in Norfolk, and we expressed a wish to visit the liner United States, which was then tied up at the dock there. And Frank piled us into his Oldsmobile, which was the size of a small aircraft carrier. And we drove down to the waterfront, and it became very clear that Frank was getting a little bit lost. So he found a neighborhood police station, and he went inside, and we thought he just went in for directions. After about 5 minutes, he came out with about a 20-something-year-old police officer, and we had a motorcycle escort over to the United States, led by this young officer. And he loved to say to us, you know, we would be talking about different aspects of Titanic, and in his wonderful Norfolk accent, he would go, well, let me tell you boys how it really was that night. And of course, Frank was only an infant at the time, so everything was secondhand. He was really very much larger than life.
Thank you, Charlie. See, those are great stories. Is it, and correct me if I'm wrong, is Ava Hart the one that was entertained with a toy pig that plays music in a lifeboat?
No, that was Edith Russell.
Edith Russell. Okay, all right.
It was very interesting. Eva, for many years, was opposed to artifact recovery. And when I last saw her, it was in the summer of 1995, and she passed in February of 1996. I forget how the conversation came around to it, but we started talking about artifact recovery. And I'm the only one in the world who can say this, and you'll have to take my word for it. We were talking, and I said to her, you know, Eva, there's going to come a time when there are going to be no survivors left to touch the younger generation with Titanic's story, the story of your father. And the artifacts will be all that's left to tell young people that these were more than just names in a list in a book. And she paused for a moment, and I could see that she was processing that. And very quietly, she said, yes, Charles, you're right. The artifacts deserve to be brought up. She had done a 180 in the final months.
So, you know, we've talked a little bit about survivors. I'd like to transition a little bit to some of the people who didn't make it off. And Tad, when we met, you said that you've done some more research into Thomas Andrews, and that you had some interesting things to share about that. Would you mind kicking us off there?
Sure, and I have to give credit to my co-authors as well. This is something that all three of us worked on together when we were writing the On a Sea of Glass, and we found some additional things that support this since then. But there's always this picture about Thomas Andrews, who, of course, the shipbuilder who was aboard with the Harland and Wolff Guarantee Group, that he was last seen in the first class smoking lounge with his arms crossed, kind of catatonic, staring off into space, and kind of had given up on surviving. There is an actual account by an unnamed witness that some people have identified as Stewart, Jack Stewart. We can't really determine why that identification was made, but the book that presented that he was seen in there as the last place and kind of had given up was in 1912 by an author called Shan Bullock, who interviewed and got to know some people that Thomas Andrews knew, and had written this book that was really a very wonderful biography, considering when it came out so shortly after the disaster. Really gave a good picture of who Andrews was as a human being. And even that author who presented this account of him being seen in the smoking room in 1912 never said it was the last time he was seen. He presents other examples of when Andrews was seen on deck, supposedly throwing deck chairs overboard, helping others, and then going towards the bridge. When Bill, Kent, and I were writing our book, we found numerous newspaper accounts from a young mess steward named Cecil Fitzpatrick, who survived, had a very harrowing ordeal. He was on deck late. He ended up in the water aboard Collapsible B, which is the lifeboat that was upside down, barely survived. He had told a story of seeing Thomas Andrews and Captain Smith together on the bridge, having a conversation right before or shortly before the water came over the rail, in the final moments before the bow started going under completely. And he had heard them talking about how the ship was going to go soon and that they couldn't stay any longer. He thought that even at this late stage that the ship would survive. And he kind of staggered back and was stunned by this news because he didn't believe it. So we had this accounting right before the water, they're on the bridge. And lo and behold, a friend of Thomas Andrews named David Galloway traveled on the Lapland, which took Titanic's surviving crew members back to the UK after the sinking. He traveled aboard to try to find out for Lord Peary, who was obviously Andrews' relative, of what really happened. And he mentions this account from a young mess steward, fitting exactly the description of Fitzpatrick, who gives nearly the same quotes, identifications and everything, basically saying that he saw Thomas Andrews and Captain Smith go into the water at the last moment when there was nothing left to be done. And he wrote this, he was confident enough in it that he wrote to Lord Peary saying that this is what happened. So you'll never know with 100% certainty what happened from that point on, but there's a lot of reasons to believe that Captain Smith and Thomas Andrews, when there was absolutely nothing left for them to do as part of their duty, did try to take a desperate last-ditch attempt to save themselves. And you have to remember, both were family men, and even though they knew it was unlikely they would survive, I don't think they were resigned to just giving up and going down with the ship, so to speak. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. There's this heroic image. I think what really happened is equally as poignant and heroic.
Well, my goodness, Tad, it's human nature to want to try to survive, right? I mean, so I won't blame them either, especially poor Captain Smith. Wasn't he going to retire shortly thereafter? I mean, I can't imagine nearing my retirement and then this happening, you know? But yeah, thank you. That's really interesting. I think in the Cameron movie, right? Doesn't he depict Andrews like looking at the painting, right? And right, they kind of depict it the way that the folks thought it was, but apparently that's not quite accurate.
Well, I will say that that is supported by a 1912 account, but that's what happened after that point is kind of the point of contention.
Right, right. So Bill, you know, I know that you were part of the research and into the night of. Did you, were there any other interesting things from the night of that you sort of discovered in the research for the book that you'd like to share?
Give me a hint, Tad and Kent. Get me started. Well, Tad and I and George Behe had worked on a new lifeboat lowering sequence back around 2000. We discovered that the British Inquiry had listed as lifeboat lowering sequence, but there were some flaws in it, things that just didn't make sense. For example, I think they had lifeboat C leaving about 1:45. But when we started digging into it, we started finding people like Ismay, who said the he got into the lifeboat about 20 minutes before the ship sank. Quartermaster Rowe also indicated that it was toward the last of the sinking sequence. So when we put our sequence together, we moved the time of collapsible sea back to 2 o'clock in the evening. At that point in time, the forecastle is going under. The forward well deck is starting to go under. There wasn't a lot of time left at that point. But that was something we had figured out. We put that heavily into On a Sea of Glass and also our new book. We also moved lifeboat number 10 back to a later time, because at the time lifeboat 10 was being lowered, the ship was listing quite a bit to port. And we think we know the ship was listing to starboard right after the collision, but then it slowly started rolling to port. And then by the time we got to the later starboard boats, 13 and 15, it was starting to list to port a bit. We think that lifeboat number 10, the ship was listing probably 10 degrees to port. And also at about the same time, lifeboat 4 was trying to be lowered. Lifeboat 10 was actually about 2.5 feet out from the ship, and people had to jump into it. Lifeboat 4, which was forward, was actually tied up against a deck, so they were actually able to climb people in. But we believe that lifeboat 4 and lifeboat 10 both left around the same time.
And lifeboat 4, that's the one that has the Astors, Marion Thayer, right? That's like some of the wealthiest women on the ship, right?
Yes, the people who ended up in lifeboat 4, they had been told to go up to A deck, or then to go to the boat deck, and then back down and back up, and they were starting to get a little frustrated. Where do you want us to go? Just tell us. And they ended up getting into 4 down on A deck.
So, speaking of the lifeboats, what happened to them?
The lifeboats, most of the lifeboats, not all, but most of the lifeboats were actually loaded up onto the Carpathia and brought into New York Harbor. When the Carpathia actually came into New York, the first thing they did is they took the lifeboats up to the White Star dock and dropped them off. Then they went back to their own dock and they started unloading the passengers. The lifeboats were actually moved into a upper holding area, and technically they disappeared. Nobody knows. Nobody's been able to find out what happened to them. Some people will say, well, Charlie has an idea.
Go ahead, Charlie.
There's an unconfirmed rumor that one of the boats found its way into a bar in the Red Hook section of Brooklyn, New York, where it was hoisted up on the beams. I don't know what space that would leave underneath for the bar patrons, but supposedly that's where it ended its days. The Lane Lifeboat Company actually was involved in appraising the lifeboats, and Bill is right. They basically disappeared into history because they were Titanic's boats. And therefore, remember that a lot of seamen were very, very superstitious. Anything from a sunken ship, you didn't want it near you. But also, you have to remember that these boats were banged around quite a bit. They were dropped into the water, they were hoisted up and so forth. So there was some damage to those boats as well. And I forget what their evaluation was, but it was, used merchandise basically.
Right, well, and like I said, most of the lifeboats disappeared. There were rumors that they were taken back to England and put on the Olympic. Nobody's actually found any hard evidence that happened. About a month later, they found collapsible A floating out in the middle of the ocean. It was picked up by the ship that found it, brought back in and put up in the lofts with the other lifeboats, and like the other lifeboats, it also disappeared.
Interesting, because it's the last thing left, basically, right, of Titanic, until we had the technology to bring things up, and they just disappear. And Charlie, if that story is true about the bar, that's a rather morbid piece of wall decor, I mean,
You're
wow.
Right. It certainly killed the atmosphere in the bar, that's for sure. Right. But the other thing to bear in mind is they had to put those boats up on the second floor level of the pier, Pier 59, because overnight there were souvenir hunters that had descended on these boats, and they were basically prying loose anything that they could get their hands on, nameplates and all of that, some of which are still surfacing in auctions today. And the police were, I guess, kind of sporadic in terms of the way they were guarding things. So finally, they put them up out of harm's way, basically, on the upper deck of the pier.
Huh. So we know, gentlemen, that, sorry, Kent, go ahead.
I was just going to add to all of this that if you look at the larger picture of all of the different liners at the time, after Titanic went down, whereas before, even the day before, everyone said you didn't need lifeboats for everyone. The very next day, all of these other ships, Lusitania, Mauretania, all of these other ships were stocking up on lifeboats. And so if, some of them might have been too badly damaged to use, but it wouldn't be surprising if some of them had been recycled to try and, there was definitely a shortage of lifeboats at that point.
Yeah, which makes total sense. And White Star was still completing Britannic, right? So, and they added those terrible davits. My God, it really spoiled the look of the ship. But yes, Tad, go ahead.
Not to belabor the point on lifeboats, but something that I've thought about, a connection. You figure World War I was just a brief period of time, breaking out in 1914 after the Titanic disaster. And as Kent said, there was a scramble for boats to be added to existing liners and then new regulations and everything else. I often wonder if one of the big legacies that we overlook with Titanic was in the short term, at the very start of World War I, a lot of liners, both large and small, had adequate lifeboats for all. What would have happened if Titanic hadn't sank and regulations had taken a little bit longer? They were in the works already when Titanic sank, but if they had taken longer, then as bureaucracy is, it takes a while for our laws to change. And the war broke out, you might have had some massive losses of life, even more so than there were on some of those vessels early on in the war.
The problem, of course, also is that if you used full-size lifeboats that we're talking about, they had to be fitted under the davits in order for them to be launched. They were too heavy to be just manhandled over the side. So your davits, in some cases, were too short to accept a second boat under the first. And the initial solving of that problem, you had the full-size boat up above and then a collapsible boat underneath, which conserved space under the davits. Going back to something we were talking about earlier, the list of the ship, one of the things that surprises me is that we have those reports of people having to jump some distance into the lifeboats. Titanic was, I think, the third ship in the world to have these special well and davits, which literally could be adjusted in terms of how far they reached out away from the ship. And rather than having people jumping into the boats, it would have been relatively simple for the crew to crank those davits back inward a little bit to close up that distance. But remember that the crew, for the most part, while they had some practice in most cases on the Olympic, were not familiar with these new davits. And as a result of that, that feature was probably not really known to them.
That's really very interesting, Charlie, to think about, that they just didn't know how to use them right. Ken, yes, go ahead.
Of course, you also have to remember, to go hand in hand with what Charlie just said, that there had been a lifeboat drill, which had been scheduled for that Sunday morning on board the Titanic, and yet it was canceled because of high winds. They didn't want to be doing that sort of thing while the ship was moving at sea in a high wind. Would have been actually very dangerous. So what little experience those crewmen and officers had with those davits, they actually had less than they otherwise might have, because that drill had been canceled early that day.
Wow.
Going a bit further, the lifeboat drill that the crew had back in Southampton was a very meager affair. They simply put two boats out over the side, mustered the men on the deck, lowered the boats down, rowed them around, and pulled them back up. All the boats were not launched. All of the crew were not exercised. It was just a select team of seamen that were involved with these two boats, and that was it. So when the disaster comes, a lot of the crew on the ship had really not received training other than what they might have received on the Olympic.
Tad, yes, go ahead.
Just to go on along with that point with how unprepared some of the crew were for what was to happen, like we have numerous reports from stewards, other crew members who they had lists that showed where they were supposed to go. They had assigned boat stations. Oftentimes they would show up at the assigned station and the boat wasn't being loaded, or they would be waylaid by somebody who gave them an order to go elsewhere. So a lot of what was supposed to be organized, even when people tried to go to where they were assigned, it didn't necessarily work out that way.
And the boat assignment lists were only posted, I think, Sunday morning, and a lot of the crew simply hadn't even seen the list yet, which made it even more complicated.
So just, to pivot a little bit, so we certainly know that there are many enduring myths about Titanic, like the switch conspiracy, right? The coal bunker fire, the substandard steel, the small rudder, and Kent, Bill, and Tad, your new book, I think does a great job of addressing these really beautifully. It's very interesting, well done, gentlemen. So Kent, would you mind kicking us off with this topic of the myths about Titanic?
There's been a lot of controversy and conspiracy talk about Titanic over the years. It never ceases to amaze me the lengths that people will go to get a good headline, because the basic overall story hasn't changed. So they're always looking for kind of a new angle on things. And what's interesting to me, whether it's the switch conspiracy, which is absolute fantasy. You just take that on its own. It would have required too much work and too much time, and there would have been hundreds and hundreds of people who would have had to have known what was going on. And you simply can't keep something that big a secret, especially when you think about the Irish workmen who were building the ship. It's kind of a laughable idea that there was never any real deathbed confessions in mass of hundreds of these workers that said, yes, I took part in that. In that switch, I helped rebuild B deck in space of a week, because the differences between Olympic and Titanic were much more than just the enclosed promenade on A deck. And many of Olympic's crew actually transferred to Titanic. And so they would have been right onto something. Many of their quarters had been improved, that the layout had been shifted slightly around. You can tell, if there's a scratch on the door or on the floor or something. I mean, suddenly you would have known, oh, this is my old ship, and they're trying to pass it off as a new one. So it really does.
Can you tell for our audience what the switch conspiracy is? Because some of them may not know. I've read the book. So would you mind just giving a brief synopsis of it?
That's a good point. The basic theory goes that in September of 1911, when the Olympic was struck by the cruiser Hawk, that it was so badly damaged by that encounter that it was unrepairable, or at least it would have been fiscally unrepairable to put the ship back into service. And so the theory goes that Olympic and Titanic were switched, and the old Olympic, under the new name Titanic, was taken out into the middle of the Atlantic and sunk, and something went horribly wrong in the process, and all these people died when that wasn't exactly what the intention was. Depends a little bit on who's telling the story, whether there was any nefarious intent or anything like that. But it really falls apart, even on just its merits, beyond the technical of the differences between the two ships. Olympic and Titanic were largely self-insured by the White Star Line. And so they really had to foot the bill for the loss of the ship that sank on the 14th to 15th of April. And so it wouldn't have made sense for them to take the Olympic out and sink it, especially since just to get the Olympic from Southampton out to that spot in the Atlantic, thousands, hundreds of thousands of pounds would have needed to have been spent in repairs just so that it could perform as well as Titanic was performing on its maiden voyage. So when you think about it, it makes for a really nice, catchy story. And I know it goes around YouTube a lot, and it's on TikTok and all these other social media platforms. But when you look at the facts, even in just under skimming the surface, it really does fall apart.
Yeah, Bill.
And to go a little bit farther than that, when the Olympic was sent to the breakers in 1934, I think it was, they took the interior woodwork off. And on the underside of the woodwork, it says from number 400, which was Olympic's number. None of it said 401, which was Titanic. So what we've seen from the boat that was sent to the breakers 1934 all says Olympic. Down on the ocean floor, one of the propellers says 401, which is the Titanic number. There's no evidence anywhere that the ships were switched, and like Kent said, there wasn't enough time to do it anyway.
Yeah, it blows my mind when I talk to some conspiracy theorists, I'm like, do you know how many people would have to keep that a secret? Like these conspiracy theorists about the federal government. I'm like, the federal government can't keep a secret, guys. That's kind of the joke of the federal government, right? No secrets are ever kept, right? So lots of conspiracies out there. I think with disasters and things like this, it's kind of human nature to do it, right? Tad, did you have something you wanted to add?
Yeah, I'll be brief because I don't want to monopolize the time. But the other thing which really irks me, and I'm sure a lot of other researchers, is the claim that Titanic was somehow built with cheap steel, cheap materials, and that's why it sank. You can go into this for hours just on that topic, but the thing that most disproves that is you have the Olympic, the sister ship, built from the same materials, largely the same design, had extremely heavy usage during World War I, rammed a U-boat, was torpedoed, and the torpedo didn't explode, was in all types of heavy gales over the years. At the end of its career, the hull was still in extremely good condition. It held up way better than its contemporaries, like the RMS Aquitania, which had some fracturing, and particularly the big German liners. And also they had smaller vessels, like originally was a Holland America, but like the Justitia, which was given to White Star Line after the war, but like during World War I, it was a troops carrier, and it was torpedoed. It was a similar design to Olympic and Britannic on a smaller scale, built from similar grade steel, and actually was torpedoed 6 times before it sank. So that grade of steel that was being utilized was very durable. There's no evidence that White Star skimped on things to save a few dollars, and that's why the ship sank. It's just a completely asinine claim, and there's nothing to back that up at all.
Right. Yeah, go ahead, Charlie.
The ships were built at Harland and Wolff on a cost plus basis, which meant that there was a set price, and then Harland and Wolff would add a set amount for its profit. And there would have been no reason whatsoever to skimp in the construction of the ship. And it's also borne out by the fact that when Harland and Wolff ships went to the scrapyard on a per ton basis, they achieved lower prices for scrapping because they were so difficult to take apart. They were that well built that you really took a shellacking in terms of the price realized for sending your ship to the scrapyard.
Thank you. Yeah, Ken.
Just briefly, there's another subject that's been making the rounds a lot in the last few years, and that has to do with the fire that was in the coal bunker of Titanic. And this is something that has really been, it's made a lot of headlines as if it was some new finding. And yet you go right back to 1912, and the fire was well known even during the inquiries. It was openly discussed. It was no secret. And it had made its way into many books over the years. I remember when I was younger reading Mr. Haas and Mr. Eaton's book, Triumph and Tragedy. And I remember they touched on the coal bunker fire in that way back in the 80s. And it's just this sort of thing where we know there was a fire, but it wasn't an unusual event on ships of the period. Coal bunkers, when they were loaded, sometimes the coal would chafe and there could be a spark. And many people think of a fire as like a tinderbox, some enormous conflagration. And really what it was is just a smoldering fire. And in fact, we know that the fire was extinguished the day before the disaster, and that the crew members had gotten into that bunker. It was cool enough so that it was habitable. And one of the crew members even remembered that he was tasked with applying oil over the bulkhead where the fire had been. It was cool to the touch. There was nothing untoward that happened. And some have cited the flood of water in Boiler Room 5 as evidence of fire damage. And really, It was just that the coal bunker door had been shut early on, and the coal bunker itself had filled with water, and the amount of water that rushed in is pretty consistent with the coal bunker, which was not watertight. It was not intended to hold back like the watertight bulkhead. The bunker door apparently collapsed, and that's what caused that rush of water in boiler room number 5. It doesn't seem like it was a whole watertight bulkhead collapsing, and again, evidence that the ship was badly built or burnt to a crisp.
So I know that folks have more to add, but I just want to pivot because we're limited on time. And I want to kick it back to you, Brandon, with Eloise and Lucien. How did you discover them? Are they well known in West Virginia and just not as well known out of the state, or what was your process there?
Well, I've always leaned toward the stories of the people on the Titanic. And, I had heard, I'd read about Eloise. There had been a few things mentioned about her in various books. Mostly it was usually just a paragraph or so, kind of summarizing her story. And Huntington, where she lived, as I found out, was not very far from where I lived. So she was the most local survivor to my home. So that gave me sort of an easy access to actually go to her hometown and research her. And the more I found out about her, the more fascinating she was. And I realized she had this huge, tragic life story that had never really been told in its entirety. And that was what really prompted me to bring her story out into the open, because she really symbolizes everything that is tragic about the Titanic. She was in love, she was pregnant, on this maiden voyage, lived a life of luxury, and suddenly all that was derailed.
And I really enjoyed the book. And so for the audience, the gentlemen are being modest. I will plug their books. So Brandon is called Gilded Tragedy, West Virginia's Titanic Widow. It's a great read. Encourage you all to get it. And then the newest book by our friends Bill, Kent, and Tad is really wonderful. They got me an advance copy. It's called Recreating Titanic and Her Sisters. It's awesome. If you guys are interested in Titanic, go for it. So we're gonna have to bring Jen back in just a moment, but before we do, I just wanna ask one question. I wanna go around the group. So I'll kick it off. What I'd like to know is your favorite Titanic movie, because there are many. Mine is 1953 Titanic starring Clifton Webb, who is always typecast as a snob and is hilarious in this role. And of course, Barbara Stanwyck and a very young Robert Wagner before he killed Natalie Wood. And it's a great movie, terribly inaccurate, but just a fun movie. So let's go around. We'll start with you, Tad. Favorite Titanic movie?
You have to ask me the hard question first, right? I
we
think
can move to Charlie. If you need more time, we'll move to Charlie.
No, it's okay. I mean, there's a lot of them that have like very good merits. I mean, A Night to Remember, partly because of how special that book was and remains to be even today with everything we've learned since then. The movie version, there's just something very sentimental and special about that for a lot of people, because it's how many of us got interested in the story or got more interested in the story. But you can't discount James Cameron's movie, because whether you love it or hate it, the amount of interest that generated in the actual historic subject and what that led to after that, you have to give that respect. So you can love it or not, but that's something you have to definitely give props.
Thank you, Tad. Charlie, how about you?
Oh boy, I think it's a little bit of a tie. A Night to Remember is what hooked me on the story at the tender age of 12. So I've been at it for 60 something years, and we won't talk about that anymore. But I actually saw young people. I taught ninth grade for many years, and our English department at my school actually adopted A Night to Remember as a novel length piece of nonfiction writing. The kids loved it, and you had to pry them loose from it. And they loved doing research on their own in terms of the people. And I think the movie depiction is very, very accurate. The only thing that by modern day standards is incorrect is the fact that it shows the ship going upright as one piece. And we now know that it split and did not. Cameron's movie, I think, is exceptional in terms of its sets and the operation of the ship and so forth. The only regret I have is that on that factual background, Mr. Cameron imposed what is really the equivalent of Romeo and Juliet on the Titanic. And that fictional story, I think, confuses some people to the extent that there's actually a grave up in Halifax, Nova Scotia, that is being bombarded with teddy bears and wreaths and lays and all kinds of stuff, excuse me, because they think it's Jack Dawson. And it's actually a crewman named John Dawson that's there. But, you know, history and fiction kind of blur together there. And that's unfortunate. But certainly I agree that brought back Titanic interest just as much as the artifacts did in the early 90s and late 80s.
I see you shaking your head, Kent. Do you agree?
There's
Cameron?
a lot of wonderful things about the James Cameron movie in '97. I remember the first time I went to see it, I was used to A Night to Remember and other older movies where you could tell it was a model in a tank. And suddenly on this big screen over our heads was the Titanic. And whether it was the score by James Horner or whether it was seeing all these rooms that we'd been looking at black and white pictures of in color, stunning. So I never say anything bad about the Cameron film, because not only was it an enjoyable movie, but it also spawned a lot of wonderful and very serious research. But I do have to give props to the one that I grew up on, which was the 1979 film SOS Titanic. And when I refer to that movie, I don't mean the short movie that was released in America. It was the longer cut that was initially released. I think it was in the UK. And it had this wonderful attention to detail about the people. And there were some fictionalized elements and a lot of mistakes, and I don't think they got any public room on the ship right. But I really enjoy the learning about the people that were on the ship. It's a very emotional thing to watch that movie, the longer version of it, and to learn how to connect with even the fictional characters. You learn about the real people that were on the ship. And that's the movie that I grew up with. And so I have to give it a shout out.
I think that's a great one by Kent, by the way. Love Cloris Leachman, who, of course, right, famous from the Mary Tyler Moore Show, but plays unsinkable Molly Brown in that one. All right, Brandon, we'll throw it to you, and then you, Bill, and then we're going to bring up questions.
For me, my all-time favorite Titanic film is A Night to Remember. I still remember seeing it. I was probably 12 years old. It was shortly after the Cameron film came out. AMC was replaying it. It seemed like every day. And I watched it every single time that I could catch it. And, you know, that was where I first heard what turned out to be Lucian's speech to Eloise. You know, the boat is thoroughly equipped. Never dreaming I would one day write about the real people who were involved in that scenario. But I also, you know, I have to give credit, as everyone else does, to the James Cameron film. I was almost 12 when it came out, and I still very vividly remember the night I went to see it. I actually felt nervous before going in because I knew about the Titanic, and I realized I was going to witness this horrible tragedy on the big screen in a very big way. And as the movie progressed, I still remember sitting there, and I didn't want it to get to April 14th in the storyline. I clearly remember that so well. I did not want to see the ship go down. I didn't want to see it. I was so moved by seeing that on the big screen above me that I, you know, of course, I can't overstate what an impact that had on me.
You know, Brandon, I know that feeling because so while I was a kid, we didn't have the Cameron. What I remember dreading watching but loving watching was the Poseidon Adventure, a 70s disaster flick, right?
Yes.
Because it's star-studded, one, and then you know it's coming, and it's so terrifying. But
yes.
All right, Bill, we're gonna throw it to you, and then Jen, we need you to come get us some audience questions. Go ahead, Bill.
Well, like everybody else, A Night to Remember in Cameron's movie in 1997. When I rewatch those movies today, I sit there and specifically look for the accurate parts of them. Even a few years ago, I was watching A Night to Remember, and I'm going, look at this scene here. They did it right. It was a scene from the forecastle looking back along the side of the ship, and you can see them lowering the lifeboat. And I'm going, they didn't have to make this accurate, but they did. Now, Cameron's movie, there were a couple of scenes in there that just blew me away. I saw it, I think, opening night. And when the ship was sinking, when they showed people getting sucked back in, I was going, I never thought about that aspect, but that probably happened. And then there was the final scene as the ship goes down, Rose is in the water, and the camera pans back and you see hundreds of people in the water. And I'm going, this is what happened. This is real. Cameron got this right.
Yeah.
And it just blew me away, and it still freaks me out even now.
Yeah, yeah, it is powerful. Absolutely. Well, gentlemen, I have thoroughly enjoyed this, and it's been, we went over time. No surprise there. Jen, do you want to come back up, join us, and ask some questions from the audience?
No, I don't, because that means we're coming to a close, and I don't want this to end. I am, as I said, a devoted Titanic fan, and I've learned so much this evening. Thank you all for sharing so much of your knowledge and enthusiasm with us and our audience tonight. As I often do, I'm going to invoke host privilege and ask a question of my own. And I had shared with some of you during our tech runs the fact that I have a dog named Kitty, who's named after Kitty Astor, who I believe is a dog who belonged to the Astor family, who went down with the ship. Can you talk about any animals that were aboard and what their fates were? Brandon?
Survivor Robert Williams Daniel, who was from my home state, Richmond, Virginia, was actually bringing home a prized French bulldog, which he called Gamin de Picombe. That dog at some point was actually in his cabin. He was keeping it in his cabin on A deck. Fellow survivor Edith Russell recalled seeing the dog as she passed by the cabin door during the evacuation. And the dog unfortunately did not survive, but had a lasting impact on Charlie's friend Eva Hart, who recalled seeing the little, they have the bat-eared, they look like they have bat ears. And she remembered that cute little dog and later got one of her own later in life. So he sort of had a legacy afterward in a way, even though he did not survive. But Robert did own several bulldogs. He later owned an English bulldog, several prize-winning bulldogs. But his champion on the Titanic didn't make it.
Oh.
And Charlie, go ahead.
The ship's kennels were down, way down low, I think on F deck, next to the butcher shop. And passengers in first class were able to go down and visit their dogs during the trip. And the legend has it that John Jacob Astor, after saying goodbye to Madeline in Lifeboat 4, then went down and released the dogs that were in the kennels. And a couple of them supposedly were seen on the deck afterwards. So,
oh my,
not trapped.
I hadn't heard that. Thank you. Well,
And by
thank
the
you.
way, Kitty was an Airedale.
Thank you for that. I didn't know. Thank you. Okay, so audience, a number of people want to hear what's the biggest misconception around the sinking of the Titanic. Maybe everybody could try that one.
Tad, yeah, go ahead.
One of the bigger ones tends to be that there was some sort of extreme negligence on the part of Captain Smith or the crew by doing what they were doing by going full speed into an area where there was known ice. There is a lot of evidence, documentation, and things that this was standard procedure and protocol when conditions were clear. And that Captain Smith did largely what most other captains of ocean liners would have done in similar circumstances without there being like fog or something that was impeding vision. So I think this gross negligence is something that's kind of come up to explain that after the fact, because hindsight being what it is, it does seem, why would you do something like that? But you got to look at what standard operating procedure of crews and were in the Atlantic operations back then.
That's a good one.
Charlie.
I think a major misconception, and I've heard it a million times, is that Titanic was out to break the transatlantic record. And the ship was never designed to go that fast. Its maximum speed, as far as we know, was about 23¼ knots. Meanwhile, the Lusitania and Mauretania were crossing at 25 to 26 knots. If the Titanic had put on all this extra speed, it would have meant arriving in New York in the dark, which would have torpedoed any efforts at publicity on White Star's part. And it would have meant that the passengers would be cooling their heels. They would have to be fed another meal, waiting for customs and immigration to open the following morning. So it just doesn't make sense that the ship was being driven at its maximum rate across the Atlantic.
Oh, that's fascinating.
Brandon, go ahead.
One of the things that I think is, I think people tend to have the conception that the Titanic was unique in the fact it didn't have enough lifeboats. That's always, honed in on, justly so, but I don't think the majority of people realize that that was how it was, that, the Olympic didn't have enough lifeboats. Virtually none of these big ships carried enough lifeboats to carry the full complement of passengers and crew.
Yeah, but they were carrying the lifeboats required by the letter of the law, right?
Actually above it.
Above it, right? Yeah, they actually had more.
Yes.
So because
Yes,
it oftentimes in human history, right, it takes a disaster before we fix the laws, right? We didn't have outward swinging theater doors until the Iroquois theater fire, right? So
and there's even a Titanic link to that.
Is there?
Yeah.
To the Iroquois theater fire?
Yes.
Let's hear it.
Go for it.
Let's see. I don't know if I say their name correctly, but it was Ida and Jean Hippoch. Hippoch from Chicago. Ida was the mom, Jean was the daughter. She had 2 younger sons who died in the Iroquois theater fire. And then she and her daughter later survived the Titanic. So they're connected. Yeah.
That's crazy. Wow. 2 of the greatest disasters of the 20th century, and she's connected.
Same with the Carlton Hotel fire. I don't know if you've heard of that one in London in 1911. Robert Williams Daniel climbed down a rope outside and survived that. 6 months later, survived the Titanic.
Wow.
Molly Brown survived a hotel fire in Florida.
That's right.
And Kent, did you have I saw your hand up, Kent. Did you have something you wanted to add?
I also think that there's a lot of criticism of many members of the crew and the officers on how they handled the evacuation. And what's really remarkable, 2 hours and 40 minutes seems like it's a long time. But when you stop and you go through events in real time and you think about just how much they had to get done to go from everyone's in bed, you don't have a PA system or a general alarm system, to getting all 20 of these boats away in the water, it really is remarkable that they managed to accomplish what they did in the amount of time that they had available. And a lot of people, they talk about how few lifeboats Titanic had and how they should have had more. What they're forgetting is that the officers and crew only had time to launch 18 of the 20 boats they had. The last 2 were still on the deck as the ship went out from underneath them. And for the people who made it to those lifeboats, some did survive because of them, but they were not a sure haven of safety. In fact, many people who initially reached those boats perished during the night from the cold. So it's not like if you'd necessarily had, 20, 30 extra boats that you would have had twice the number of people that survived. And when you think about it, they really did a wonderful job with the circumstances that they were dealt with. Many of them acted very heroically.
And yet the saddest number of that night is that more than 400 seats in those boats were sent away empty. And that's because of failed communications. As Kent has said, no PA system, no alarm bells. You got a knock on your door. The steward would say, go up on deck with your life jacket. Your initial reaction is, what, are you crazy? I'm not going to leave my nice warm cabin to go up on deck. And the result is a needless loss of better than 400 lives.
And how do you do all of that without starting a panic? Because you don't have enough lifeboats for everyone, and a panic is only going. Incredible events that night, for sure.
Bill, you had your hand up?
Yeah, and we know by quite a few accounts that some of the third-class people were not allowed up on the boat deck. I've been working with Shelley Binder, who's the great-granddaughter of survivor Leah Axe, and she was trying to get up on her decks with her baby. Charlie had mentioned Frank Axe. She was trying to carry the baby, but she had to be lifted up the outside of the deck houses because they wouldn't let her up the stairs. And she's not the only one that this happened to. Certain people could not get up on deck. The scenes in Cameron's movie where they're trying to get through the doors, well, in some senses that happened.
Lightoller actually had in his mind a plan to fill the boats partially up on the boat deck or A deck, lower them down to the water, and then fill them the rest of the way. Because he wasn't quite sure how many people could be safely put in a boat, even though they were marked with capacities. But so he dispatched a bunch of seamen to go down and open the lower gangway doors. And apparently that was his idea for how the third class would get into the lifeboats. That would be right along E deck, the Scotland Road that the third class passengers used. By the time the men got down there and began getting to work on opening that gangway door, it was underwater and all of those men were lost. And basically the third class were left cooling their heels until finally, it wasn't because of any order from the bridge necessarily, it was that the crew was sensing that the ship was beginning to tilt. And while they were standing guard at a lot of these barriers, eventually they gave that up and went up to the boat deck to help out. And in many cases, by the way, it was not floor to ceiling gates as you see in some movies. In many cases, it was just a low 4-foot high fence, basically, with a steward guarding it. And once that steward left, now people were free to go right past it. They were not locked either. They were fastened, but not locked. And the reason for that, of course, was American immigration laws, which did not allow third-class passengers who would have to undergo inspection for health issues to mix with first and second class passengers who didn't have to go through that.
And right there, that says Jack couldn't have met Rose.
Right.
They wouldn't have let it happen.
Well, just in the past 5 minutes, the number of misconceptions that you've explained, and I think the general sense that I'm getting as an audience member is that most people in charge were doing their best, and there wasn't a lot of negligence as we've been kind of accustomed to believe. Everybody was doing what they were supposed to do. It just was a really bad scene and wasn't going to turn out well.
You know, it's amazing to think that in 1956, when the Andrea Doria is struck by the Stockholm and assumes a very, very strong list immediately, the half of the lifeboats were rendered unusable because of the list. And the first boats to leave the Andrea Doria somehow managed to be filled with stewards and crew. And people were dumbfounded by that. When you look at Titanic, there were very, very few cases of crewmen getting into a boat without a direct order to do it.
Wow.
And they stayed down below in many cases, or were doing their jobs right up until the end. The postal workers.
And there were a number of cases where some of the crew did get into lifeboats and they were chased out.
That's right.
I'm distinctly remembering like some stokers had all got into a boat and somebody ordered them out. Captain Smith, I might have been, or Lowe. I don't remember the details right now.
And yet, ironically, there were some lifeboats that really could have used the men in terms of taking the oars. And you have Molly Brown organizing the women of her boat to take the oars to get away from the ship.
Now, we only have a few more minutes, but there are a whole lot of questions, and you've already addressed this a little bit, but I'd just like to spend another minute if we can. The decisions made, Captain Smith's decisions. There are a lot of the questions about from our audience about if he had done this, should he have done this? And you've kind of said he did what probably was the standard protocol. But can you address any of the, if he had, hit it head on, hit the iceberg head on rather than an angle, or, is there anything you can talk about that maybe would have made things turn out differently?
let's kick it off with Kent maybe, and then go to Charlie.
Kent.
Thank you. I think one of the things that we all have to remember is that these are some of the most scrutinized hours in history. And it's very, very easy for people when they're, watching a movie or when they're going about their daily routine and it's going around the back of their minds and you're just thinking about it to say, oh, certainly the benefit of hindsight, I could have done better, or I would have done this instead of that. But you have to remember, this was the first time that everyone on board the ship was going through this particular scenario. They had no advance warning. And a lot of times, sadly, they're condemned for making decisions that, in hindsight, maybe they weren't the best. But as Tad so eloquently pointed out earlier, in many cases, this was 1912 standard operating procedure. This is how you do things. And they can't be blamed for not being able to think outside the box in the heat of the moment. Like, should the ship have hit the iceberg head on? Well, that might have had a different outcome. But First Officer Murdoch, who was in charge of the ship at the time, as a trained officer, you're going to do your best to try to outmaneuver the danger, to take the ship out of harm's way. And in fact, he had done that once before. Once before in his career, he had managed to avert danger by literally grabbing the helm himself and throwing it hard over, and he'd saved the ship from a serious accident.
Oh.
And so in this particular instance, he did the best he could with what he had in front of him. And what's really sad is when you think about it, he only had to turn the ship another couple feet. And none of us would be sitting here tonight 110 years later talking about the Titanic. It would be something dusty and relegated to the trash bin of history, and not many people would think about it, because he came very close to pulling off a miracle with that maneuver that he pulled that night.
Charlie, you had your hand up?
Well, Kent has said a lot of what I was going to say. They did do some calculations, and that's all I can do. You obviously don't take a ship and ram it into an iceberg and see what happens, although that happened in the case of a couple ships just before Titanic, and they all survived. So there was some evidence that when in doubt, ram and hit it hard, But they calculated that if the ship had hit head on, it probably would have crushed back to the forward mast. 2 compartments probably would have flooded. You would have killed the crew right at the bow of the ship, and the third class unmarried men who were right after them in the collision. So there would have been a death toll, but the likelihood is that the ship would have stayed afloat. What doomed it was the fact that the cut runs along roughly a third of the ship's length. And there's another misconception. Even in 1912 books, you have pictures of a gaping hole in the side of the ship. And in reality, what it is a series of bumps. And if you take all of these punctures, and that's what they really were, and even some rivets being sheared off, the total area of the hole that sank the Titanic was 12 square feet. Just 12.
Oh my gosh.
And as a matter of fact, during my dive, we actually came along where the cut was. And while most of it is buried under the sand, I did get to see a little bit of it. And the slice is no bigger than the first knuckle on my thumb. Literally, if I tried to stick my thumb in it, which of course is impossible at that depth, I wouldn't be able to do it.
Wow. So I'm going to have one more question, but before I pose that one, I do want to give a shout out to the Titanic International Society, our co-sponsors of tonight's program. It's a nonprofit historical organization based in New Jersey that was founded in 1989 to preserve and perpetuate the memory and history of the Royal Mail ship Titanic and those who sailed aboard her maiden and last voyage. So do know that if you click that green button and make a donation tonight, it will be shared equally by the Mark Twain House Museum and the Titanic International Society. I also want to thank my friend and colleague Mallory Howard, who's been active in the chat tonight and has posted links to books that you can purchase by tonight's panelists. And please take advantage of that opportunity. So again, I'm going to be a little bit selfish. We talked about this during our tech run, and one of the audience questions is about the music aboard the Titanic. And I'd like to hear you talk about, did they play Near to My God to Thee as the boat went down?
All right, Tad, take it away, buddy.
Yeah, we had talked about this the other night. I think most of the panelists, not to put words in anybody else's mouth, but we do believe the evidence shows that Near My God to Thee was played, but there's a question of which version. One of the things that has unfortunately become a misconception is that there was a song called Song de Tom that was played, allegedly, that was a waltz. Nobody ever mentioned that by name. Harold Bride, the wireless operator who was struggling for his life in the water, claimed that a song called Autumn was played. He didn't specify what it was. Subsequent research has shown that there really was 3 other survivors who mentioned Autumn being played, and one of them, Margaret Hayes, described it as a hymn, not as the waltz that has been picked up by modern and repeated over and over again. So the band definitely had upbeat music, and then later, as things got grim, switched to hymns. It's almost hard to believe that really happened, but that's what they did. And I really do feel the evidence strongly shows that band leader Wallace Hartley would have picked that song. And we have talked about the different versions, but I'll let somebody else speak to that, so I'm not monopolizing.
So Brandon, and then we can go to Charlie.
Just a couple of tidbits that I have found. Survivor Robert Williams Daniel, who was likely on the ship up to the very end. He lived on a large plantation in Richmond, Virginia, which was actually called Brandon. But there was a church on the plantation that he attended. And according to his daughter-in-law, who I've interviewed, he was explicit that at any service he attended, they were never to play Near My God to Thee, because it brought him back to that night when he heard it.
Wow.
And also at Lucian Philip Smith's memorial service, Eloise had Near My God to Thee played as sort of a tribute to him. Which it's a common hymn, but I found that interesting that she chose that as well.
Wow.
Those are just 2 tidbits I had relating to it probably being Near My God to Thee.
Thank you, Brandon. Very interesting. Charlie, do you have anything to add?
My late writing partner, Jack, did a lot of research into this, and he strongly believed that the tune that was used was Proprior Deo by Sir Arthur Sullivan of Gilbert and Sullivan fame. And it sounds a lot like another version, which might have confused some people. But Jack's rationale for this, Hartley's father was a Methodist minister in the UK. And Hartley played the organ at his father's church and therefore was familiar with that particular tune. We also know, or Jack found, that Hartley had actually told a friend, the friend asked him, Wallace, if you were facing your final moments, what would you do? And he'd say, oh, I'd probably choose Nearer My God to Thee, the Sullivan setting. So that's pretty good evidence there also. Autumn and Songe d'Automne, when you think about the men gathered on the deck, they didn't have music in front of them. Both of those songs would be probably fairly complicated to try to do on a tilting boat deck. And bear in mind that maybe some of the musicians would not be really familiar with it anyway. So that was Jack's assessment, and he was pretty adamant about it. And if I knew this question was going to be asked, I actually have the version on my computer, and I could play it, but we don't have time for that because I don't know how to do 2 things at once. So we'll try that some other time. But look at Proprior Deo. It's on the internet. You can find it.
And I would offer that perhaps if you wanted to send a link after the program is over, I could add it to the chat and people could listen to it. Again, the program tonight is recorded and people can watch it anytime they like, but the chat remains live. So if you were willing to do that, we could make sure that people could access that link. And I'd like to hear it too.
Okay. And Kent, you see your hand up there?
Just very briefly, last year, Tad and Bill and I released a real-time animation of the sinking. And when it was re-released with improved audio and special effects, the team who did the animation for us, they actually had a recording of Proprio Dio. And that is the recording that you hear as the ship is beginning to sink in that animation. And there's moments when the hair on the back of your neck stands up when you see something and you know that's the way it happened. And for me, when I'm watching that animation back and listening to it and hearing the music echoing across the water, it raises the hair on the back of my neck because it has that, we know what the research says, but to actually have a recording of it and to be able to hear it in that setting with those visuals, it almost will bring you to tears just watching it every time.
Wow. Well, I'm glad that we talked about that. Yeah, I think so too. And I just cannot thank all of you enough. And Jason, thank you for your typically awesome work in preparing for this evening. And all of you, I wish we could talk over and over and continue this conversation. But please, just a show of hands, how many of you have visited Mark Twain's house in Hartford? Okay. The rest of you, we'd love to have you come visit and tour Mark Twain's house. I think you'd find a lot to love and a lot to connect with. So please let us know when you can get to Hartford and join our merry crew of authors and historians associated with the house. So thank you, everybody. Thank you for your generous donations. And again, supporting the Mark Twain House Museum and the Titanic International Society. Thank you for your awesome questions. And let's do it again soon.
Thank you, Jen. This was fun. Thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you.
Good night, everybody.
Thank you,
Thank you.
everyone.
Good night, everybody.
Thank you.